Tenemos a Hauke Engel de Frankfurt, que nuestro trabajo en cambio climático globalmente. Está Mekhala Krishnan de Boston. Ella lidera nuestras investigaciones en riesgos de cambio climático en nuestro think tank McKinsey Global Institute. Y también tenemos a Sophie Underwood desde Londres. Ella lidera nuestro desarrollo de conocimiento en riesgos de cambio climático globalmente en distintos sectores. Entonces, vamos a estar hablando yo en español y mis compañeros en inglés. Entramos directamente en la primera parte y doy la palabra a Mekhala y Hauke.
Very good. Thank you, Clemens. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining today. Very excited to be speaking to you and hopefully discussing with you also during the course of this. So we'll have Q&A where gaps interspersed, and then please also feel free to use the chat function to ask questions throughout. And let's make this an interactive sessions. So we wanted to start by just adding some perspectives on the COVID crisis and how that could possibly impact the climate change. And as you see on this page, of course, the lockdowns that we have undertaken in a response to the COVID crisis, to the pandemic, are having a marked effect on emissions. So on paper, emissions are down drastically, but of course, this is coming at a high price. So no one is suggesting that this is a good thing. On the contrary, I think the cost with which we've bought these emission reductions are immense, and this is not the way forward. However, it is important to say that even longer term, coming out of the crisis, this crisis could have a strong and lasting effect on how we address the climate challenge. So if you go on the next page, there are several factors that could actually help accelerate the decarbonization transition in this crisis. So we're already seeing a big shift in behavior. We've all forced to learn to work from home, and we're learning that's actually possible. Teleworking, doing this webinar via VC rather than in person, it's absolutely feasible. And some amount of these changes hopefully will stick and help us make the behavioral changes that we need to reduce the energy intensity and the emissions from our way of life. And we may see supply chains being reconfigured. As we know, a lot of the supply chains, the global supply chains have been disrupted as a result of the pandemic, and supply chain managers may react to that to reconfigure supply chains to nearshore and hence reduce the embedded transport emissions in our products that we buy. We may also see a better awareness and recognition of systemic risks at large, so pandemic risk, but also climate risks. There may be a spillover effect in terms of risk recognition that will lead then to stronger action being taken on climate change. And we may see lower interest rates going forward, which then will enable us to finance the changes required, the investments required to decarbonize more easily than in a higher interest rate environment. At the same time, we could see several factors play out that could actually delay or make more difficult to take action on climate. So right now, we've already seen a dramatic collapse in the oil price, which makes certain zero carbon technologies less cost competitive because fossil fuels are just a lot cheaper. So it's a lot less attractive to switch to an electric vehicle if the diesel and the gasoline is a lot cheaper. We also see, rightfully, understandably, that politicians, decision makers are right now prioritizing the immediate crisis impacts, the lives and livelihoods that need to be protected over longer term challenges such as the climate crisis. This may sustain for some time, as we may see that climate and other structural challenges that we're dealing with before the crisis, such as inequality or reskilling and climate, may actually not be top of the agenda for some time to come. And we may see that we have less room for maneuver from the financial public sector perspective. If governments now spend and take on new debt to combat the fallout from the crisis, they may have less fiscal playground, so to say, to invest into decarbonization in the future. And we may even see, as a result of the crisis, some resurgence of nation-state rivalries and a kind of reduction in global collaboration on global challenges such as the climate crisis. So it could go either way, really. I think it's quite early to say right now which way it's going to go. I think there are some hopeful signs that people take kind of a through cycle mindset to this, that climate remains on top of the agenda, but it really is a pivotal moment. So the way we now respond to this crisis and that the actions we take now will have a big impact also on the defining challenges of the rest of the decade, which is arguably the climate challenge. And one point we wanted to make here, go to the next page, is that there is actually no trade-off between combating the crisis and making progress on climate. So when we look at the types of things a government could do in response to the economic recession that is now all but certain to follow, there are many things that would have a positive impact both on decarbonization, on advancing the climate agenda, and on having a socioeconomic impact that would help combat the crisis impacts. So just 3 examples we showed here from energy, from construction, and from farming, where we have kind of a green lever, as we call it, so something you could do that would both advance the climate agenda and create jobs and stimulate the economy, and what we call the gray lever, so something that we might do if we didn't care about the climate. And as you can see here, it's the green levers, the green measures that actually perform better on the socioeconomic impact dimension on job creation than the gray levers. Now, of course, we're not saying this is universally true. Of course, other examples we could find where it's the inverse, but the point really is that there doesn't have to be a trade-off. So you can do things that make progress on the direct crisis impacts, that create jobs, and that help us to decarbonize and make the transition to a low carbon economy. So I think that's just what we wanted to highlight in terms of the COVID crisis and the climate challenge. So the problem is not going away, of course, and it actually is a unique opportunity also in some ways to make progress on it. At the same time, there's a big risk that we face further delays and we lose momentum. So it really is a moment of truth for progress on the decarbonization challenge. So much we wanted to say up front on the COVID challenge. Let us now go on to the main topic for today, which is really the topic of physical climate risk. That's what we wanted to talk about today. Was some research we did and where we basically set out to understand the socioeconomic impacts of physical climate change. So as you know, of course, it's quite well understood what happens to the Earth system when we emit greenhouse gases and the Earth warms. What we felt when we started doing this work about a year ago, what was a lot less well understood, is how those changes in the physical environment, as the rising sea levels, the heat waves, would then actually impact business and society. So the socioeconomic impacts resulting from physical climate change. And that's what we want to spend the next 10-15 minutes talking about. And then the rest of the time we wanted to use to then make that more practical and tactical and talk about what companies and organizations could do to respond to those risks. So this is not a presentation about reducing emissions. It's really about the physical risks from climate change, the increases in hazards in our natural environment and how those impact business and society. And this is just a framing page here. So and I'm sure you know all this, but essentially, since the Industrial Revolution, we've burned a lot of fossil fuels to power our lives, to power our economies. As a result of that, the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere have increased substantially, which in turn then has led to an increase in average global temperatures. One important nuance here that you see on this page is that those changes are not evenly distributed. So some parts of the world are warming faster than others. So all climate change is local. This is, of course, it affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone in the same way. And if we want to take a look at the next page, just to illustrate what those changes look like. Here we map out the current level of drought. So this is the percentage of a decade spent in drought today. And you can see this is already a picture that looks quite heterogeneous. There's some parts of the world that see droughts more often than others. But then if we wind the clock forward to 2030 and 2050, if you go to the next page, you can see that picture change. If you go one page further still, you see it change again. You can really see how some parts of the globe really start lighting up here. So the change in drought intensity, or rather the percentage of a decade spent in drought, increases quite dramatically. in some parts of the world. So close to my home, you see here the Mediterranean is very red. Mexico is red, and of course, closer to your home, the tip of Latin America is also quite red. Whereas other parts of the world, like India, like northern Russia, don't actually see a dramatic change. Yeah, what's important to say here up front, of course, is that what we looked at here is a scenario where we don't take strong climate action. So the rationale for this is that we wanted to investigate a world where we don't act, as we wanted to look at what's called the inherent risk. So it's the do nothing scenario, so to say. It's a world of continued high emissions. In technical terms, it's the scenario RCP 8.5. Which is basically the no further climate action scenario from today out to 2050. So that's the scenario we look at. It's hopefully in a way a worst case scenario, and we still have room to avert some of these changes if we take strong action to decarbonize in the next decade. So this was an example on this page on drought. We just wanted to highlight one other example to illustrate the physical changes. Now on this page you can see in extreme events, here we see the hurricanes, strong storms in tropical oceans, where we see the change in likelihood of a hurricane of a certain severity happening. So we look at the baseline, what used to be a storm of strength that would occur once in a century, a 100-year hurricane at the end of the last century. And this is now what you see here is the forecasted increase in likelihood of that hurricane by 2040. And as you can see, both in Florida and in southeastern United States on the left-hand side and in Southeast Asia, the probability of such a storm occurring doubles and sometimes even triples in the next 2 decades. So there's a quite dramatic increase in the likelihood of such an extreme event happening. And this is quite an important notion. When we think about physical climate risks, there's kind of the average, there's the percentage of decade and drought, for example, like average expected events, and then the extreme events, really big one-off things, and both of these are changing. So the severity and likelihood of those are changing as a result of climate change. Here's the next page. So really, just to repeat the framing I gave in the beginning, when we think about climate change, there are really 2 types of risks that people typically talk about. There's physical risk, which is what we focus on today, which is the risks directly occurring as a result of the changing climate. And then there's the transition risk, which is then the changes that society that might undertake to reduce emissions, which then in turn, of course, also have negative impacts on some stakeholders that need to be navigated. So today's focus really is physical risk. And what we hope to do in the next few pages in this first section of today's presentation is to give you, through some examples, a way of thinking about these physical risks, a mental model to be able to understand these risks and how to think about them in your own organizations and how to apply them to your own context. So with that, let me hand over to my colleague Mekala, who's going to take us through some of that research we did.
Great, thanks very much, Hauke. So as Hauke was saying, one of the main goals of this work was to take the climate science, which tells us that climate events are becoming either more frequent or more severe, and start to translate that to socioeconomic impacts. And at the face of it, that may seem quite straightforward, but as we started to dig into it, one of the things we realized is that every socioeconomic system around us, whether that's the human body, whether that's physical infrastructure, whether it's agriculture, whether it's financial systems, all of these systems have either evolved or been designed for the climate of the past. And what that means is that as the climate starts to shift, we could start to see nonlinear impacts, meaning that even small changes in climatic conditions could have significant impacts on these systems. And this is a very important thing for us all to internalize because, as I said, these assumptions are so implicit to everything that we do as a company. When you think about making investment decisions, when you choose about, where to locate a factory, when a city thinks about infrastructure design, all of that has embedded in it a stable climate, and that assumption of a stable climate may no longer hold. So let me illustrate that with a couple of examples on this slide. So let's look at the middle example here, which is looking at the impacts of flooding on an example UK train station. And what you see from this example is that for certain amounts of flooding, we only see small damages to this asset. So up to about 0.5 meters of flooding, only about $10 million of damage is seen to the asset. But as flooding starts to increase more and more, at about 2.5 meters of flooding, you start to see that the asset impact, the asset damage substantially rises. So this is an example of a nonlinearity where beyond a certain flood depth, you could start to see significant impacts on the asset. The same is true if you look at the very right when we think about agriculture. So agriculture around the world has been optimized so that we grow crops in certain locations that are suitable to those crops. But as the climate changes, that climatic suitability may no longer hold. And with this example of corn or maize, what we see is that up to about an 18 degrees Celsius temperature, yields of corn continue to rise. But beyond that 18 degrees Celsius threshold, you could start to see yields dramatically reduce. And so as regions of the world start to become warmer, places where we grow this crop may no longer be viable for this crop, which has implications for the viability of our bread baskets globally. The same is true on the very left when we look at the human body. So the human body performs optimally under certain conditions of heat and humidity. And as those conditions are breached, our ability to work outdoors starts to diminish. Our labor productivity in economic terms starts to become less optimal. And we see that at about this 25 degrees Celsius, what is called a wet bulb temperature, which is a combined measure of heat and humidity, where beyond that threshold, the human body's productivity starts to fall. We work less efficiently, we may tire more easily, we may need to take more breaks. And so this has profound implications for parts of the world that rely significantly on outdoor work like agriculture or construction. We may also eventually start to see thresholds crossed where heat and humidity conditions become so extreme that human beings, if they're exposed to 4 or 5 hours of heat and humidity, may actually be at risk of mortality or dying. Around the world, we've experienced heat waves today, but nowhere on the earth have we experienced heat waves that are so intense that healthy human beings sitting in the shade may be affected. And now we find that with climate change, there are parts of the world, and these are often the more populated parts of the world, that could experience such conditions. So let's look at what all of this means for socioeconomic systems across the world. So if we move to the next slide, as we looked at various kinds of impacts on socioeconomic systems, we found that broadly speaking, they could be categorized into 5 different kinds of impacts. They could impact human beings, which is what we call impacts on livability and workability. They could impact natural capital, both in terms of our food systems, as well as other forms of natural capital, things like impacting forests or impacting oceans. And then finally, they could impact physical capital. And that's both things like impacting physical assets like buildings, but also other forms of physical capital like metro systems, transportation systems, road networks. And so what all of that firstly means is when you think about what these 5 systems are, they are essentially the factors of production in an economy. They are what economic activity relies on. Economic activity relies on labor, physical capital, and natural capital. And all of these very systems start to get affected as the climate changes, which calls into question the very basis of our economic growth. The second thing that our analysis found is oftentimes people think about the impacts of climate change as being far off, something that happens in the second half of the century. 2100 is a number that people often talk about. But what we found is that we could actually see significant impacts already in the next decade. By 2030, across these 5 systems that we examined, we could see substantial increase in risk to the point where large numbers of human beings, large amounts of economic activity could be at risk. So just to give you a couple of examples, what we find is that already by 2030, 250 to 360 million people could live in areas that have about a 10% average annual likelihood of experiencing lethal heat waves. Remember, I said nowhere on the earth have we experienced heat waves that healthy human beings, when exposed, could be at risk of dying. But what we find is that by 2030, parts of India, parts of Pakistan, other parts of South Asia could experience such conditions at quite a high probability, a 10% average annual probability. Take another example, when we think about capital stock. capital stock is typically designed to withstand certain flooding events, as I talked about before. But what we find is that going forward by 2030, the risk of damage to capital stock could effectively double between what it is today. And that's just from one form of flooding, river flooding. You could see further increases when we think about events like wildfires, when we think about events like hurricanes, so on and so forth. So all 5 systems could be affected and impacts could already be seen by 2030. And if you move to the next page, what we see is that if you fast forward to 2050, under this RCP 8.5 inherent risk scenario, risk could continue to further increase. For example, that livability and workability number that I talked about of lethal heat waves, that number of 250 to 360 million could rise to 0.7 to 1.2 billion. That doubling of capital stock damage that I talked about could now quadruple 4 times. So all to say, substantial impacts are already here. What climate science also tells us is that warming for the next decade or out to 2030 is essentially locked in because of past emissions. So there is some amount of risk that is already baked into the system that we can't get rid of by decarbonizing. And so we will essentially need to think about finding ways to adapt to manage this increase in risk that is already guaranteed. So that's sort of the global picture. I wanted to end this part of the presentation with a few examples of specific countries, geographies, asset types that we looked at to give us more a picture of the nature of this kind of risk and the types of impacts we're talking about. So one question we asked ourselves was about India. Will India get too hot to work? Most economic models, most companies assume that economic growth for India is likely to continue for the next 10, 20, 30 years. India is one of the big opportunities that people talk about when they think about growth in the future. But what we find is that going forward, as the climate shifts, the very basis of that growth could be impacted as heat and humidity conditions rise. As one example, we talked about heat and humidity impacting labor capacity, our ability to work outdoors. And you see in the top panel here that the share of working hours that become essentially unworkable because of rising heat and humidity could become more and more extreme by 2030 and by 2050. Now, India is a country where 50% of GDP, 75% of economic activity relies in some way on outdoor work. It relies on labor in agriculture or labor in construction. And so a conservative estimate finds that by 2030, already up to about 4.5% of GDP in India could be at risk as hours become unworkable outdoors. But it's not just about chronic increases in heat and humidity. What we also find, as I said before, is that large parts of India, as well as other parts of South Asia, could start to experience lethal heat waves that we've never experienced before, putting a significant share of the population at risk. And so all of this certainly is a challenge that India needs to grapple with. It's also a challenge to our very assumptions of global growth and where we're expecting global growth to come from in the coming decades. If we move to the next slide as one more example related to agriculture, essentially most of the global grain production across the world happens in a few regions. We get 60% of our global grain, which makes up majority of our calorie intake, things like rice, corn, wheat, or soy, from 5 different regional bread baskets around the world. So we've essentially optimized production in a few geographies where it's suitable to grow these crops, but that may have come at the cost of resiliency. What concentrated production of this kind means is that because a few regions make most of the grain in the world, if these regions become at risk as a result of a changing climate, that puts global food security at risk. And that's indeed what we find from our analysis. Essentially, the annual risk of a 15% decline in global yields, which we call a global breadbasket failure, that could double by 2030 and quadruple by 2050. And if you stop and think about that, certainly that has implications for the availability of food across the world, but we've built up food storage levels so that it's possible to draw down on grain that has been stored in reservoirs across the world. But as we start to draw down on our safety stock, what that's going to do is increase grain prices. And as prices increase, that affects the most vulnerable populations in the world the most. As we've experienced with the COVID crisis, the effects of the crisis are most felt on people that have the least ability to cope. And that's what climate change will do as well. It is a regressive form of risk. where the most vulnerable populations in the world will be most affected. I wanted to leave you with one final example, which is related to the impacts of flooding. So we've talked about the impacts of flooding on actually damaging capital stock. But what we also find is that there are other impacts of flooding on capital stock that could happen maybe even in advance of those damages actually occurring. And that is in the form of asset prices. Financial markets essentially pull forward expectations of future risk. As soon as investors or prospective home buyers start to recognize future risk, they may start to factor that into their buying decisions today, which could have implications on prices already in advance of an event happening. So before a home is even flooded, the impacts of that expectation of flooding could start to be priced into the value of the home. And we already see that happening today in real estate across the world. So this is an example for Florida real estate, where we looked at homes that are exposed to regular flooding and compared the prices of those homes compared to unexposed properties. So we compared like-for-like properties, homes that have the same property size, same number of bedrooms, so on and so forth, everything we care about when we're buying a home. And we found that we're already seeing devaluation as a result of climate change today. Already today, homes that are exposed to tidal flooding on a regular basis in Florida are devalued at about $5 billion. Fast forward to 2050, these homes could experience $30 to $80 billion of devaluation. And that's about 15 to 35% the value of these homes. So there could be significant price effects on these homes. And this, I would say, is a conservative estimate because it's only looking at impacts on the home itself. It doesn't take into account what if key infrastructure is impacted, what if schools are affected, what if road networks are affected, so on and so forth. So there could be significant risk that is already pulled forward in asset prices in advance of actual climatic events. This case also, if you turn to the next slide, illustrates one other point about climate change, which is that like COVID, climate risk is a systemic form of risk. Although the direct impacts are local, meaning they are directly felt in a region affected by a flood or a hurricane, they can have all kinds of complex knock-on nonlinear effects on other systems beyond the directly affected system, as well as on other geographies. So let's look at this example for Florida. The first order impact that you could imagine in Florida is the damage to the home, as well as the impact on the asset price, the home price. But Florida is a state where a significant portion of homeowner wealth, as well as a significant portion of the state's taxes, come from property prices. And so there could be all kinds of second and third order effects as these risks manifest. We could start to see significant nonlinear increases in prices if more than one home is affected, if multiple homes in a particular neighborhood start to be affected. We could start to see a loss of state revenues, and as a result, property taxes, and as a result, further economic development, further business activity. So as we've experienced with COVID, so also with climate, it's important to recognize that these are not risks that will stay contained. And there could be a whole multitude of nonlinear, complex knock-on effects beyond which we've imagined that are important to keep in mind as we think about managing this form of risk. So with that, we wanted to pause on this first section and open it up for Q&A. If folks have any questions, happy to take them at this point.
Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, por favor, se la puede dar en el chat, o si se atreve a preguntarla en inglés también, se puede activar el micrófono. Y puede ser también en español y se puede traducir.
Si nadie quiere hacer una pregunta en esos momentos, vamos a pasar a la segunda parte, que tiene que ver con la aplicación, con los riesgos específicos para Chile. Y yo creo que ahí van a haber varios paralelos, pero también situaciones más específicas, y les dejamos abierto el chat para preguntas y por favor anímense, porque es importante también tener su feedback. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Sí, también para despertar a nosotros con algunas preguntas quizá este lunes por la mañana. Miramos entonces un par de detalles para Chile. en la lámina siguiente empezamos con una pregunta para ustedes que debería aparecer en la pantalla de todos. Y la pregunta es, ¿qué tan importante creen que van a ser estos riesgos físicos de cambio climático para su organización durante la próxima década?
Han contestado un poquito más de la mitad de los participantes, así que los invitamos a terminar las votaciones para compartir los resultados.
Bien, vamos a ver directamente el resultado ahora.
Voy a finalizarla en el 73%.
Ok. Es difícil decidirse, aparentemente. Ahí vamos. Ok. Wow. Fuerte eso. Como respuesta, obviamente no va a tener la misma importancia para todas las industrias. Y también creo que acá tenemos una audiencia y nosotros mismos que estamos... sabemos de eso en detalle, estamos convencidos de la importancia en eso y seguramente en sus organizaciones no toda la gente opinaría lo mismo, pero el resultado es bastante claro, creo. Bien, miramos entonces Chile. Acá nosotros los mismos modelos que usamos para nuestro estudio global, lo corrimos para Sudamérica y revisamos especialmente en Chile cuál es el pronóstico bajo este escenario fuerte de RCP 8.5. Esto es un mapa del aumento de temperatura. Vemos que la comparación entre hoy y el año 2050 hay bastante aumento de temperatura en Chile. El aumento más fuerte en el norte, en áreas que ya hoy día están, diría, un poco más acostumbrados quizá a estas temperaturas, pero también la zona central, donde tenemos los centros urbanos principales de Chile, se proyecta un aumento de temperatura de 3 grados, entonces realmente un aumento drástico. En la lámina siguiente vemos qué sucede con las aguas superficiales, también la comparación contra hoy. Y lo que se ve acá es que en general en Chile va a haber menos agua y justamente la zona central con la mayoría de la población y también mucha agricultura tendría una disminución de 70% de aguas superficiales, entonces una disminución drástica. Después en el norte podría haber un poco más, un aumento de aguas superficiales, ahora eso de una base muy pequeña que muchas veces si son eventos climáticos extremos, entonces mucha lluvia en poco tiempo en realidad daña más que ayuda a la sociedad o al medio ambiente. Y eso también se ve en la lámina siguiente, donde tenemos el mapa de la frecuencia o del aumento de la frecuencia de eventos extremos, de precipitaciones, donde no hay tanto cambio para Chile. En general vemos algo en el sur de Chile y después en el norte vemos alrededor en la cordillera que ahí sí van a haber eventos más fuertes y eso después es el agua que llega con fuerza a áreas y ciudades que no están acostumbrados y no están construidos para estos eventos acá en Chile. Y en la lámina siguiente se ve como resultado un pronóstico de sequía y eso es realmente, o eso podría ser realmente un cambio muy fuerte, donde vemos que globalmente un área que podría tener más sequía es justamente acá en el centro-sur de Chile, y el área de alrededor de Temuco, Concepción, podría tener una probabilidad de estar un 90% del tiempo de una década en estado de sequía, y a partir de 2050, y ya en 10 años se ve un aumento grande de la probabilidad de estar en sequía. Y eso entonces es el resultado de tanto la disminución de aguas superficiales como también el aumento de temperatura en Chile. En la lámina siguiente es creo que el último mapa que vamos a ver. Eso es un pronóstico de cambios del bioma, donde vemos que en todo Sudamérica hay regiones que van a tener estos cambios, y en Chile, ante todo, se pronostica para el sur de Chile. Entonces ahí por el cambio climático, de temperatura, de patrones de precipitación, pueden haber estos cambios. Y en la lámina siguiente vemos un pequeño resumen, entonces, cuáles son cambios que Chile va a tener que enfrentar. Sabemos que hay varias vulnerabilidades, y a base de estos cambios que se pronostican en estos modelos, tenemos escasez de agua, obviamente. Tenemos cambios en los patrones climáticos que creo que algunas industrias ya hoy día en Chile están experimentando. Vamos a ver desplazamiento de zonas adecuadas para cultivos y árboles específicos, entonces muy importante para todo lo que es agricultura, para los forestales. Vamos a ver algunos eventos climáticos extremos, o vamos a ver algún aumento de eso. Vamos a ver reducción de poblaciones de peces, que también se van a desplazar, y tenemos obviamente una costa larguísima, y esta está vulnerable. ¿Qué significa eso en números? No es exhaustivo eso, pero estas vulnerabilidades al lado izquierdo impactan a sectores, industrias en Chile que representan un 80% de las exportaciones. Tenemos algunos números más detallados para minería, con su importancia para Chile. 80% de la actividad minera hoy día en Chile está en zonas que hoy día ya tienen estrés hídrico. Vemos que este estrés hídrico se puede aumentar en un 40% ya en los próximos 10 años. Y por ejemplo, si eso significa que todo el agua dulce que usa la minería hoy día tiene que ser reemplazado por agua desalinada del mar, eso costaría a la minería en Chile una inversión de unos 15 a 20 mil millones de dólares. Y obviamente también tiene impacto en el costo de producción por la electricidad que requiere eso adicionalmente. Eso es el resumen de Chile. Y antes de entrar en cuál tiene que ser la respuesta de las empresas, quizá lo que más interesa a ustedes, vamos quizá a tomar un par de las preguntas del chat.
Sí, tenemos, Clemens, varias preguntas acá. Quizás algunas también que Joka y Miquela nos pueden ayudar a responder. Entonces, one of the questions that has been raised in the chat is, what is the methodology to calculate risk? And if there is an official one. So maybe Hauke or Michela, we can start with this question.
Can you ask it again? I'm not sure I understood it, Antoine.
Yeah, so the first question was, what is the methodology that is used to calculate risk, and if there is an official one?
Yeah, so there's two parts to this, right? There's the forecast of the expected increases in intensity or frequency of the physical hazards, so of the heat waves or the storms or the rain events. That's part one. The second part is then translating a given hazard into a socioeconomic impact, so loss of economic activity or assets, etc. For the first part, this is basically what the climate scientists are doing. There's an established set of models and a community, or a global community of climate scientists who do exactly this. And we didn't do that ourselves. So for everything you saw here, we actually worked with the world's leading climate scientists who interrogated the established gold standard climate models to provide us with the projections of the expected future hazard intensity and likelihood. The second part we then did ourselves, and there of course the methodology differs depending on what you're looking at, but you typically you start by looking at what's actually exposed, and so what is in harm's way, how many people live in a certain area, what kind of physical assets are there. And then you ask, what is the so-called damage function? So given a certain hazard, how much damage is caused? So this could be the human response to a certain level of heat and humidity, or it could be the structural damage that a bridge experiences when it's hit by a flood, which then gives us the first order impacts, the first order economic impacts. And then we also ask, what are potential knock-on impacts? So the immediate impacts often have then cascading impacts throughout the wider ecosystem. So a factory being damaged in Southeast Asia could disrupt supply chains and hence actually cause economic damage as far afield as Europe or the United States. But those things are usually much harder to forecast because the complexity increased dramatically. So this is usually not possible to do exhaustively, but you can at least get a feel for this by thinking about it in the right way.
Yeah, exactly. And I would just maybe add two things to what Hauke said. As we've been seeing companies look to implement risk assessments on their own footprint and operations, I think the two things that we see as quote unquote best practice, I think first is there's a set of tools and capabilities that companies need to integrate. One of that is being able to access climate models in some way, but also the ability to do geospatial analysis, right? So to know the footprint of different locations, to know what climate hazards those different locations are exposed to, etc. So there's it's important to recognize that oftentimes this will come with needing new tools and capabilities. The second thing is, as we've typically seen companies think about making these assessments, there is a combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis to be done. So qualitative in the sense of looking at maybe a set of inputs like expert inputs, like climate maps, like your own historical experience with events, and identifying what you expect to be the key issue areas for you. For some companies, it might be their supply base. For other companies, it might be questions about insurance prices and insurance availability. For still others, it might be about their logistics and distribution. So there's a step that companies often do, which is a qualitative risk assessment that you then follow on with a more quantitative risk assessment on the key challenging areas.
Very clear. We have another question, which is the following. Do you think the target of emission reduction for the next years is enough to fight the impacts that we just discussed?
How could you want to take that, or do you want me to?
You go for it.
Yeah, so the impacts that we talked about are an RCP under what is called an RCP 8.5 scenario, which is essentially what is considered an inherent risk scenario or a do nothing scenario. It's essentially saying that if we don't do anything to curb emissions at all, these are the types of risks we could experience. Now, I'm hopeful that we're not going to be under that path, and essentially we will be doing things to curb those emissions. I think the important thing to remember is that this RCP 8.5 that we talked about in 2050 is essentially the risk that you would see in a 2.5 degrees Celsius world. So if we do get on a path to curb emissions, unless we reduce emissions below a 2.5 degrees Celsius world, we will experience these impacts at some point in time. The question is more whether those impacts will be in 2050 or further delayed in 2060, 2070, so on. But this is the way to think about this is these are the impacts under a 2.5 degrees Celsius world.
Perfect. Maybe one or two last questions. So there is another question related to financial sector, actually. So how much do you think of, how much of this risk is already taken into account by the financial sector?
Yeah, maybe I can start and Hauka add on. So I think the financial sector is starting to factor in these risks to some degree, right? So for example, the illustration that we showed you related to Florida real estate, we do see that homes that are exposed to flooding are priced less than unexposed homes. In some cases, we've also seen insurance premiums start to rise as people recognize that risk is more than they originally thought. There's also been studies by institutions like BlackRock that have looked at things like municipal bonds in areas that are exposed to climate risk, areas that are not exposed to climate risk, and those municipal bonds adjusting for trying to make a like-for-like sample are trading at different values. So there are instances, there are examples to suggest some amount of this risk is being factored into financial sector decisions and valuations. But I think what our work would suggest is that there is maybe more risk in the system than people recognize, and that there is more risk because going back to the point I made, the assumptions of a stable climate are so implicit in every aspect of our lives that our understanding of how much we are really assuming a stable climate in every decision, I think, is totally underappreciated. So for example, as a company, if you think about where you're expecting global growth to come from, have you factored in climate risk into that? And have your investors factored in climate risk into that? If you're an insurance company, have you across the board thought about rising climate risk? So all to say, like, as you start to ask each of these questions of yourself and your decision and your organization, you will find that there are many examples of risk that you may not have factored in. But we're starting to see a lot of momentum towards companies doing these risk assessments, investors also doing these risk assessments of their portfolio, and start to have this be more a part of their decision making.
Thank you very much. I think we have one more minute to take a last question. So do you believe that there is also an impact on health and safety of workers, or only at the level of production output of businesses?
Yeah, let me take that one. I mean, of course there's, right? And I think what's very important to be mindful of here, whereas we often talk about kind of monetary impacts or kind of GDP impacts, this is a very intensely human story, right? Because all these impacts have a severe impact on many people's livelihoods as well. And there will be lives lost, there will be livelihoods destroyed. So this absolutely has an impact on people. And I think this is very important to highlight and something we shouldn't lose sight of. So of course, as Mekla explained, in India, is people suffering, people potentially being exposed to lethal levels of humidity and heat. We talk about people losing their homes, or people losing their jobs. Absolutely. I think this is very much something that impacts people all around the world.
Yeah. And if you remember, I described it as being a regressive form of risk. I think it will impact people across the world, and it will impact the most vulnerable the most, because they have the least financial means to combat the risk. They are often in the very sectors that are most exposed to risk. So outdoor sectors like agriculture, construction, they rely more on natural capital. For example, they work in areas like fisheries. So all to say, this is intensely a human story, and this is fundamentally about lives and livelihoods.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's move to the last section of this workshop.
Y volvemos al español, un rato por lo menos. Gracias por las preguntas y si tienen más preguntas lo pueden poner en el chat durante, en cualquier momento. Miramos ahora cuál debería ser la respuesta de los negocios, de las empresas, para adaptación y mitigación. Y esta sección se va a terminar con un par de ejemplos concretos que vemos en otras regiones. Y empezando con otra encuesta, que también su organización ha evaluado su exposición al riesgo, a los riesgos físicos del cambio climático. 3 opciones a elegir.
Voy a esperar a que lleguemos como al 50% para mostrar los resultados. Ya estamos en 42, así que...
Son como las elecciones a nivel nacional, 50%, con eso ya se toma la decisión.
Sí. Ya la voy a finalizar ahora.
No se hizo. O se hizo en una cierta medida. Creo que eso está bastante en línea de lo que vemos también en otros países, donde hay una brecha entre la respuesta a qué importante va a ser, por un lado, que sí se cree importante, y por otro lado, bueno, en cuánto se ha hecho entonces, y ahí normalmente la respuesta es no tanto. Bien. Entonces,
Clement, sorry, can I just jump in here just for in case of interest? So we have done this poll now with folks as we've done this presentation across geographies. I just wanted to say that the responses in Chile are actually very much in line with the global responses, in case anyone was curious about that.
Thanks for jumping in. Yes, no surprises here, I would say, but great to have it cleared up. Bueno, nosotros pensamos que hay que pensar en 3 dimensiones distintas para el lado de adaptación y mitigación de los riesgos físicos del cambio climático. Primero, hay que incorporar estos riesgos en las decisiones que se hacen. Hoy día todos los procesos internos de toma de decisiones, las reuniones de gestión y seguimiento, etcétera, hay que incorporar cómo identificar estos riesgos y qué hacer con estos riesgos. Eso requiere obviamente también un cambio en la organización. Alguien tiene que estar responsable para cuantificar estos riesgos, se requieren las capacidades para medir eso, se requieren cambios a la gobernanza. Entonces eso es más quien lidera eso dentro de la organización. Y finalmente hay habilitadores que hay que o establecer o que cambiar. Por ejemplo, tiene que existir la tecnología para capturar estos datos, para manipular los datos. Y también es un cambio, va a requerir un cambio cultural. Vemos si los temas de sustentabilidad se quedan en las áreas de sustentabilidad de las empresas y ellos son los responsables de eso, pero las áreas que realmente pueden hacer una diferencia son las áreas quizás más operacionales o financieras, donde se tienen que tomar decisiones distintas. Estos mismos también tienen que cambiar su cultura, tienen que incorporar la sustentabilidad y el cambio climático en sus hábitos. La segunda dimensión en la lámina siguiente es entonces qué adaptación se requiere. Hay una adaptación física de los activos, si ya existen, no se pueden mover, tienen que protegerse. Nueva infraestructura tiene que evaluarse bajo estos riesgos físicos para decidir sobre el lugar de los activos y el diseño, la ingeniería de los activos. La adaptación financiera requerida, el sistema de seguros que tiene que tomar en cuenta estos riesgos, pero no solamente de manera, como lo vimos en algunos lados en Estados Unidos, donde simplemente ya no te dan ciertos tipos de seguros para ciertas casas porque hay un riesgo demasiado grande de inundaciones y la familia que vive ahí entonces está sin protección. Y se tiene que movilizar el capital para tener poder hacer estas inversiones hacia el futuro. Y finalmente también una adaptación conductual. Eso significa que hay medidas preventivas que se tienen que tomar, donde hay riesgos, por ejemplo, hablamos de los riesgos para los trabajadores, ante todo expuesto al clima afuera, pero también pensar en algunos lugares del mundo ya está empezando eso, en la reubicación de comunidades, algo súper difícil y algo para lo cual todavía no existe realmente un mecanismo establecido de cómo hacer eso, cómo tomar estas decisiones. Y tercero, por supuesto, la respuesta de las empresas tiene que sea en la lámina siguiente también de mitigar lo máximo que se puede todavía. Eso significa bajar la huella de carbono. Eso es una prueba de costo de bajar la huella de carbono de todo Chile. Es un estudio de descarbonización que hicimos nosotros acá. Y sin discutirla en demasiado detalle, pero nosotros hicimos un estudio para diseñar la hoja de ruta más económica para Chile de lograr carbono neutralidad en el año 2050, donde Chile realmente lideró en este ámbito, uno de los primeros países de imponerse esta meta. Y acá en esta curva se ven distintas barras, cada barra representa un cambio tecnológico. Entonces, por ejemplo, de moverse de un auto que funciona a gasolina a un auto eléctrico, y el ancho de la barra representa el aporte total de este cambio tecnológico específico a reducir la huella de carbono. Y después, si la barra va hacia abajo, eso significa que durante el ciclo de vida de esta tecnología hay un ahorro económico en comparación con la tecnología actual que está reemplazada por esta nueva tecnología. Y esta curva se ve bastante distinto que en otros países. Hemos hecho este cálculo en varios países y lo que es distinto es que acá en Chile hay mucha más reducción que se puede hacer de manera económica que en otros países. Se ve que solamente al lado derecho hay algunos cambios que cuestan dinero, entonces estos son los que están arriba. En el año 2050. Entonces, Chile ahí realmente tiene una gran ventaja y vemos que están siguiendo este camino con la actualización de los NDC un par de semanas atrás. Y en la lámina siguiente, como resumen, entonces, esta descarbonización puede ahorrar dinero a Chile como país. Eso no significa que va a ahorrar dinero a todos los individuos, eso es un promedio como país. Tampoco significa que eso es la hoja de ruta que se va a seguir, es la hoja de ruta más económica, no es la hoja de ruta más fácil quizá a implementar políticamente. Sí pensamos que es una oportunidad inmensa para Chile, tiene el potencial acá de convertirse en un líder reconocido a nivel mundial, donde si uno compra algo en el mundo que está importado desde Chile, que proviene de Chile, uno sabe que eso es algo sustentable, algo bueno, algo real. Y pensamos también que todos los chilenos pueden beneficiarse de esta descarbonización si está bien hecha por no solamente el ahorro económico como país, sino también por los impactos favorables en salud, menor contaminación, mejor calidad de vida en viviendas, y ahí hay más insulación y mejor calefacción. Y entonces, en concreto, para ustedes en sus empresas, ¿qué hay que hacer? Primero hay que obviamente dimensionar este riesgo de manera cuantitativa, lo mejor que se puede, y compararlo con la tolerancia que tiene en estas dimensiones donde vemos los riesgos. Segundo, también identificar las oportunidades. No solamente hay riesgos, sino también esta transición que se va a ver abre oportunidades a las empresas. Tercero, hacer una priorización. No se va a poder hacer todo al mismo tiempo y mejor hacer algunos temas más importantes bien que tratar de hacer todo y hacerlo a medias, y al final construir internamente los cambios en la empresa requeridos con respecto a la gobernanza, de crear las capacidades y también una cultura que incorpore la sustentabilidad. Vamos, entonces, vemos algunos ejemplos concretos de empresas que nosotros hemos visto en otras regiones del mundo que creemos que puede ser interesante para ustedes también. Y empezamos con banking. Sophie, you're going to talk about banking.
Yes, perfect. Great. Hi, everyone. So following along what Clemens was just saying, we're now going to talk about how a few different sectors are acting given everything we've just talked through. So to start with banking, I think the first point we wanted to make here is just that there is pressure from several different directions for banks to engage on climate change and related financial risks. So just to take those three in turn, the first is policymakers and regulators. Of course, this is a very locally driven aspect. So depending on where you are geographically will dictate what kind of policy you're subject to. But we're seeing increasing action from governments and regulators at different degrees across the world, requiring banks to explicitly embed climate-related financial risks into risk management frameworks. So recently there's been movement by the Bank of England in this direction, and they're intending to undertake a stress test to take into account climate risk. And this approach is something that other central banks around the world are starting to consider in different ways as well. The second push is coming from investors. So investors and asset managers are both becoming wiser to climate risks and understanding them better, and are also more interested in ensuring that funds are used for so-called green companies. And the impact of this is that we are seeing that banks are starting to change their strategy in line with investor desires and expectations. And so you see this both at sort of the bank level and also at the ultimate investor level. And we have indeed seen several banks very recently start to move because of this. And then the third more general point is that the general public and clients, the attitude is shifting. I'm sure this is something that everyone is seeing to different degrees on the news, but climate change is increasingly entering the public awareness. And of course, the public are also consumers, and they're also customers, and they're also citizens, and this is having an impact. And also a point to make here, it's not on this slide, but we're also seeing to some extent that talent is playing a role. So, you know, with the millennials coming into the workforce, there's higher and higher expectation here in movement on climate change. So they're sort of some of the reasons that we're seeing that banks are starting to shift. If we go to the next slide, we can see that the upshot of that is that banks are starting to state bold ambitions. And so we have some examples here. You'll see that there's a lot of reference to the Paris Agreement, for example, but we are definitely starting to see shifts in the sort of boldness with which banks are stating their ambitions. And indeed, you know, stating their ambitions and then subsequently working to figure out how they're going to actually achieve those. But there's certainly been a crescendo in these. And then I think just to go to the next slide to sort of bring this to life a little bit, ING, you can see that there's real integration of climate change across the organization. Overall, ING was rated, I think, the 3rd best performing bank of about 400 banks by Sustainalytics, which is one of the leading independent providers of ESG ratings. So it is one of the leaders in the field, and you can see how they're embedding this into different elements of their organization. So first, risk management. ING has decided to stop lending to coal companies, and the timeline is fairly short. They're intending to reduce their exposure to 0 by 2025. In terms of strategic opportunities, you'll see some listed there, but they've sort of made very clear that whilst they themselves, I think they've been climate neutral since around 2007, they've acknowledged that the biggest impact they can have is through their financing. And so they're trying to use that financing to publicly steer their loan book and their investments and so on towards the Paris Agreement. The next point there is governance. One example is that they've changed their org structure to have a global head of sustainability. They also have quite detailed reporting, sort of a breakdown at a portfolio level, a breakdown of their portfolio level by sector in terms of their investments and so on. And then the final point to make there is role in the ecosystem. So the first 3 are sort of more internal to the company itself, but they are signatory to several different declarations. They're members of various roundtables. They've explicitly set their ambition to bring the company in line with Paris agreements. So that's just an example of one of the real leaders in the field. But we do see that increasingly banks are starting to move in this direction. Okay, Clemens.
Gracias, Sophie. Súper. Muy interesante realmente lo que está pasando ahí. Espero que se acelere eso. Miramos otro ejemplo del sector de utilities, entonces generadores, generación, transmisión y distribución de electricidad. Ya por su naturaleza están más expuestos estas empresas a riesgos físicos de cambio climático, obviamente. Tienen activos que son muy caros y que no se pueden mover y que tienen que funcionar durante décadas. Es infraestructura, proveen infraestructura crítica. Hay muy poca tolerancia de tener paradas. Muchas veces también es un producto peligroso, por ejemplo, distribución de gas, y hay regulación muy fuerte, entonces tampoco es tan fácil de simplemente cambiar. Al lado derecho tenemos algunos ejemplos de Australia, que creo que mucho de eso también aplica acá a Chile, lamentablemente. En la lámina siguiente vemos algunos datos que quizá no son tan obvios a primera vista, como estos riesgos van a afectar a estos utilities. Por ejemplo, generación de electricidad con paneles solares o la eficiencia de esta generación, depende de la temperatura. Y para cada grado de aumento en temperatura, la eficiencia baja entre un 0,1 y un 0,5%. También la eficiencia de refrigeración que se quiera hacer en termoeléctricas depende de la temperatura del agua. Entonces, si eso sube, también baja la eficiencia ahí. También el funcionamiento de subestaciones cambia con aumento de temperatura y la eficiencia de eso cambia. Hasta la eficiencia de transmisión de las líneas de alto voltaje también depende de la temperatura y pierde eficiencia con aumento de temperatura. Y todo eso justamente obviamente en la hora peak, donde hay más temperatura y donde vamos a ver en el futuro seguramente más uso de aire acondicionado que va a poner más estrés en el sistema. Vamos a la siguiente, donde tenemos un ejemplo real de una empresa europea que tiene líneas de transmisión y distribución. Y, lo que han hecho ellos es, primero, han identificado los riesgos futuros con un mapa mirando dónde están sus activos. Y de esta manera identificaron entonces cuáles son los activos bajo los riesgos más grandes. Segundo, después han revisado dónde hay un riesgo que realmente llegue a una falla en estos activos, y en la lámina siguiente, porque no se puede abordar todo al mismo tiempo, después se ha priorizado. Y primero se ha priorizado según el nivel de servicio de los distintos activos, entonces cuánta gente y qué tipo de consumidores están en esta red donde, y en el cuarto paso se ha hecho un análisis económico, por un lado de las fallas y el impacto de estas fallas, y por otro lado de costo de hacer cambios. Siguiente, minería, también algo muy importante para Chile, obviamente, y por eso elegimos eso como uno de los ejemplos. Hay algunos ejemplos de riesgos que impactan directamente a las empresas mineras. Uno es escasez de agua y tener que pagar, eso ya vemos hoy día en Chile todos los años, esos son millones de dólares para estas empresas y también después para el presupuesto federal. Vemos también pérdida de producción por inundaciones, eso se va a aumentar. Obviamente hay un tema con las comunidades. Si tenemos escasez de agua y después, bueno, ya hoy día hay protestas, por ejemplo, en el norte, que existen las comunidades por eso. Puede haber reducción de demanda, depende un poco de qué metal estamos hablando. Acá en Chile creo que va a ser más positivo. Eso es el siguiente punto, donde vemos que hay aumento de demanda para aquellos recursos que pueden ayudar en los sectores que benefician con el cambio de sustentabilidad. Puede haber dificultades de obtener seguros o va a aumentar el precio. Vemos en muchas regiones que aumenta la presión de reducir la huella de carbono. Y vamos a la lámina siguiente, donde tenemos un ejemplo de escasez de agua específico en áreas de minería, donde ya hoy día la mayor parte de la producción de cobre en Chile está en áreas con escasez de agua hoy día, y eso va a aumentar en los próximos 10 años ya bastante. Y último ejemplo de minería, el penúltimo, acá miramos globalmente cuáles son aquellos recursos mineros que van a perder y cuáles son los que van a ganar en escenarios de descarbonización. Vemos obviamente que carbón es lo que más va a perder, pero también vemos que hay recursos como el litio que va a ganar fuertemente, entonces eso es una oportunidad para Chile. También la electrificación va a requerir más cobre, que también es algo que se ve como beneficiado. Y como último, sin mirarlo en todo detalle, es también un ejemplo real de una empresa minera que hizo este heatmap de revisar los riesgos de cambio climático que ellos ven. Entonces eso es algo que hoy en día ya se ve en este tipo de análisis de riesgos con respecto a riesgos medioambientales, etcétera, y esta minera ha hecho el mismo ejercicio, pero para riesgos físicos de cambio climático. Y con eso creo vamos al siguiente, que es el último, agricultura. Sophie, let's go.
Great. I might do this one quite quickly because I just want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. But in a nutshell, what we're saying here is, as I'm sure most people are very aware, climate risks are materializing for firms across the value chain. So, you know, whether that's in distribution or crop production, commodity traders, protein producers, these both physical and transition risks are popping up and are increasing across the value chain. If you go to the next page, these are just some examples of transition risks. And of course, they will vary by country and by region, but these are the kinds of shifts we're starting to see in policy, in litigation. Obviously, technology is changing. We've got a slide on that in a second. And then there's sort of more demand side things from investors in terms of reputation and in terms of consumer. So, you know, you can see there a few of the different transitional risks, but most of you will be familiar to some extent with some of these. And then if I just go to the next one, these are just a couple of examples. So what we see here is that companies are just increasingly improving technology as an adaptive measure in the face of climate risk. So of course, technology is increasingly being used in any event, but we'll see that deep understanding of all the different data and the ability to integrate that and therefore make decisions will become increasingly necessary as the climate changes and agricultural companies need to react to that. And then finally, on the next page, we just show more on the mitigation side, the estimated potential of Chile to absorb more CO2 through afforestation and reforestation, as well as reducing wildfires and so on. And so you can sort of see the stack there on the right-hand side, but it shows that there's an additional emission absorption potential of around 17 megatons of carbon dioxide. And so, yeah. So I know I just rushed through that, but I'm keen to leave a few minutes at the end in case people have questions and so on.
Gracias, Sophie. Sí, súper. Tenemos un par de minutos. Hay un par de preguntas. Voy a tomar una directamente que era sobre el hidrógeno y por qué no consideramos en nuestro estudio de descarbonización de Chile el hidrógeno verde para Chile. Nosotros sí lo revisamos en el estudio. ¿Por qué no aparece? Porque no está, según nuestras estimaciones de cómo va a desarrollarse la tecnología, no está dentro de las medidas más económicas para Chile para llegar a la carbono neutralidad. Eso no significa que no va a haber. Puede ser que nosotros quizá queremos descarbonizar sectores en Chile con este hidrógeno verde que son un poco más caros, donde en nuestro estudio solamente la descarbonización llegó al mismo nivel que la absorción de los bosques, pero si uno quiere llegar más allá de eso, el hidrógeno verde es necesario. O si los reguladores crean espacios donde este hidrógeno verde es más económico que otras medidas, eso también puede pasar. Pero nosotros miramos aquellos cambios tecnológicos más económicos para justamente llegar a la carbono neutralidad, y ahí es más económico de usar directamente la electricidad a través de baterías, por ejemplo, y no el hidrógeno.
Tenemos varias otras preguntas acá en el chat. Creo que podemos, Felipe me confirmó que podemos tener 5 o 10 minutos más, entonces para dar lugar a esas preguntas. So here there is a question, actually the last question on the chat. So do we have or do we know international examples where we have maps, risk maps, with at the same time on those maps locations of different factories, maybe split by industries. If we have some good example of this abroad with good results in the way we leverage some data and had a very collaborative management of this. I don't know, Hauka or Nikita, if you heard about something.
Yeah, so we do have that, right? And it's typically something that we do in a first step when we work with clients on this, and that we simply look at where the hazards are in the world and then where the assets are. Of course, it becomes a very complicated map very quickly. So it really needs to be fit for purpose. So we need to think about which sector are we looking at here, or even which companies are we looking at here. But then indeed, as we've done this many times, it is very, very insightful.
Thank you. There was another question which was actually about waste management, which was not covered in the deep dive. So I think it was relevant. Clemens, you mentioned in the last section that there were not only risks but also opportunities. So the question here about waste management is that do you think that the risk for natural resources sectors will drive demand for alternative resources from recycling, for example? I don't know, Clemens or Hauka or Michaela, if you have a perspective on this question.
Creo que no tenemos una respuesta definitiva a eso. Yo sí he trabajado algo en sectores acá donde vemos que hay una serie de presiones por sustentabilidad que sí hacen aumentar esta demanda. Esos son presiones de consumidores, son presiones de inversionistas, hablamos de eso, presiones de legislación, también presiones de competidores que llegan con algo que es más fácil de reciclar, que está basado en, por ejemplo, a base de celulosa en vez de plástico, y claramente vemos eso. Creo que hay una pregunta de si eso ahora es segunda prioridad durante esta pandemia, pero si uno mira cuáles son realmente las presiones detrás, no es algo que va a irse completamente por la pandemia, sino después va a volver. Entonces creo que la respuesta sin haber cuantificado eso completamente, hay razón de pensar que sí va a haber un aumento. Sí.
Muy bien. Y quizás para terminar sobre las preguntas que estaban ahí en el chat, había una pregunta relacionada un poco con la gestión un poco del tiempo y cómo asegurarse que estamos, digamos, gestionando los riesgos a tiempo. So the question here, Michaela, Sophie, and Hauke, is how to identify on-time specific risk for each industry. So Clemens presented the different steps a company can take as part of the client risk management. But here, the time dimension of how to do it on time, I think is the core question we have here. And also there is mention about if we have some specific information and insights regarding construction.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the on time, Antoine, but let me try and take a stab at this. So essentially, if you're a company, what we have identified is the best way to think about your risks is along a few dimensions. So first is there's the risk to your own core production. So identifying where your footprint is, what are the types of hazards, meaning flooding or wildfires or drought, etc., that your core production is at risk of facing. The second is to think about your sourcing and distribution. So what are potential upstream suppliers that could be affected? What are distribution channels, logistical channels that could get affected? The third thing is to think about your franchise value. So think about your asset base, think about the value of your brand, etc., that could get affected as a result of climate change. And then finally, financing and insurance, right? So could your investors, could there be impact on your valuations as a result of investors recognizing your risk? Could your own insurance and availability get affected, etc.? So as companies think about all of these dimensions, what we encourage them to do is to think about a set of hazards, how those hazards could impact each of these dimensions, both directly as well as the knock-on effects that that could have. And the exercise we typically encourage, as I was saying earlier, is to say, first do a qualitative risk assessment, right? So understand, take a look at climate maps, take a look at your historical experiences, take a look at expert inputs to try and say what are potential across that matrix that I described of different types of effects and hazards, where could you be most exposed? And then think about doing a deep dive on quantifying specific areas where you identify high levels of exposure. So I don't know if that fully answered the question, but that's typically the approach that we're seeing companies take, and we think is a practical approach to undertake.
Thank you very much. Before we close, I just would like to ask you to maybe answer Nicholas Gordon's question on behalf of Nature-Based Solutions. It was the first question for the third part, and I think it's really important also because we are preparing a webinar from Acción for the 20th, which has a focus on nature-based solutions. And we think that at least in Chile, we have made little progress on this behalf, and it would be very interesting to have your opinion on that and also maybe some international input.
Yeah, that'd be great.
¿Puedes traducir tal vez la pregunta de Nicolás para que la puedan...
Estaba buscando. Creo que es un poco lo que Clemens comentaba, ¿no? La pregunta que es, ¿creen que ante el escenario de desaceleración, esa, Catherine? Okay, so basically the question we have here is, do you think that in the face of this deceleration or uncertainty, economic uncertainty, if the projections of the technological implementation model could be impacted by the carbon neutrality that we presented? I think this was the first part of the question.
So it's basically asking, because of the economic downturn, if the technological solutions are going to be more difficult than we had projected, and that means that nature-based solutions are of more importance. They don't require the same level of investment, for example. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I can start, and Hauke, please add on. I think a little bit, this goes back to the start of the discussion when Hauka was talking about headwinds and tailwinds from COVID, right? So it's important to remember that there are aspects of this current situation and the recovery that could actually be tailwinds for a climate response, meaning there could be investments that we make that are towards green versus brown stimulus. This is a low interest rate environment, and so companies and countries could use this opportunity to actually finance investments. We've also done huge behavioral shifts in terms of how we live our day-to-day lives and conduct our businesses, which have implications for carbon emissions. So I think lots of potential tailwinds, of course, headwinds related to companies maybe not wanting to make investments at a period of uncertainty, etc. But I think it's important to remember that there is a glass half full version of this story as well. It's not all glass half empty. I do think that when we think about technology versus nature-based solutions, I'm not sure we should necessarily think about them as trade-offs with each other. In my mind, they are all part of the toolkit that we need to explore and look to implement based on whatever is most cost-effective, whatever is most suitable for a given situation. I think nature-based solutions can be enormously helpful, both when we think about adaptation as well as when we think about things like carbon sinks, etc., and a mitigation solution. But I don't think at this point in time where we are, this should be an either-or conversation. Hauka, I don't know if you have further things to add.
Spot on. Nothing to add. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you very much, Michaela, Hauke, Sophie. Muchas gracias también a Antoine y Clemens. Realmente les quiero agradecer como toda la información que nos han compartido. Espero que para los participantes también haya sido muy interesante. Para nosotros sin duda lo ha sido. Estamos muy felices de trabajar con ustedes y solamente quiero reiterar la fe de erratas que hemos puesto en el chat respecto al webinar que vamos a tener para medir los avances de Chile respecto al cambio climático. Va a ser el lunes 25 desde las 14:30 horas. Están todos invitados y también les quiero dejar invitados a todos a participar en el webinar sobre soluciones basadas en naturaleza, que lo tenemos el 20 de mayo a las 9 de la mañana. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Les vamos a compartir las presentaciones y bueno, espero que tengan una buena semana. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias al equipo de McKinsey por una muy buena presentación y también nos sirvió a nosotros para hacer un testeo de cómo una presentación en inglés y en español podrían funcionar, y funcionó muy bien. It works very well, so thank you very much, Michaela. Hockey, it's difficult to pronounce for me, but thank you very much, and I hope we see you soon.
Thank you all for bearing with our English. Thank you.
Gracias a todos. Que estén muy bien.
Gracias.
Gracias, Catherine.
Estén muy bien y gracias, Felipe.